soldier, Olympian, politician, and Nobel Prize winner. This is the story of Phillip Noel Baker.
Is civilization! Rome is order! Rome is power!
A date that will live in infamy.
Well, I'm not a crook. I burn everything I've done.
I am Napoleon. I am Emperor.
GI, your government has abandoned you. They have ordered you to die.
If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down in the woods today, you better go.
There are things that go bump in the night, and we are the ones who bump back.
Because today...
Philip John Noel Baker was born Philip John Baker on the 1st of November 1889 in Brondesbury Park in northwest London. He arrived in the world in the closing years of the Victorian era, at the height of Britain's imperial power, but also at a time when new ideas about peace, international law and arbitration were beginning to take shape. He was the sixth of 7 children of Joseph Allen Baker and Elizabeth Barmer Musgrip, both Canadian-born Quakers. Joseph Allen Baker had moved from Ontario to London in 1876 to establish a British branch of the family engineering firm Joseph Baker and Sons, which made machinery for the food industry. But business was only one side of his life. From 1895 to 1906, Joseph Allen Baker served as a progressive member of the London County Council, and from 1905 to 1918 he sat in the House of Commons as a Liberal MP for East Finsbury's constituency. So from childhood, Philip saw industry and idealism side by side, a factory owner who was also a Quaker pacifist and an active reforming politician as his father. His parents were members of the Religious Society of Friends, also known, as we've said, as the Quakers. Theological differences with myself aside, Quakers are a Christian movement founded in 17th century England. Again, differences aside, they believe in simplicity, equality and integrity, and they hold that there is, quote, that of God in every person. Crucially, Quakers reject war and violence. They believe killing is fundamentally wrong, with no exceptions, and that conflicts must be resolved by justice, negotiation, and reconciliation, not force. In the Baker household, this was not simply abstract theology, it was the atmosphere of daily life. From his parents, Philip absorbed 2 convictions that never left him: that work should serve as a social purpose, and that violence is a moral failure. Philip was educated at Ackworth School in Yorkshire and then Bootham School in York, both Quaker-founded institutions. These schools emphasised independent thought, moral character and service. Education was not only about passing exams, it was about learning how to live responsibly in the world. After Bootham, in 1907, he crossed the Atlantic to study for a year at Haverford College in Pennsylvania, a small Quaker college near Philadelphia. There, he was immersed in another Quaker community dedicated to peace and social responsibility, and he began to run competitively, finishing 5th in the 800 metres at the IC4A Collegiate Championships. A year later, in 1908, he returned to England and entered King's College, Cambridge, to read history and economics. At Cambridge, he sat the history tripos first. In 1910, he received a second-class degree in Part 1 history. He then turned to economics, and in 1912 obtained a first-class degree in Part 2 economics. That combination, a solid grounding in history with outstanding work in economics, foreshadowed his later career. He would spend much of his life trying to connect the historical causes of war with the economic and structural forces that kept arms races going. In 1913, he received his MA, and that same year, he was awarded the Whewell Scholarship in International Law, one of Cambridge's oldest and most prestigious prizes. International law is the body of rules and agreements that governs relationships between states. For a young man who had been raised to abhor war, it offered an obvious question. Could law, instead of violence, regulate how nations behaved? By his early 20s, Phillip Baker was already three things at once: a serious student of history, a first-class economist, and a budding international lawyer. His talents, however, were never confined to the classroom. At Cambridge, Phillip Baker was also a formidable middle-distance runner. He joined the Cambridge University Athletic Club, later becoming its president from 1910 to 1912. And also in 1912, he served as the president of the Cambridge Union Society, the famous debating chamber, a rare double in both sport and argument. Between 1909 and 1912, he dominated the university's middle distance events. He won the 800 metres against Oxford in the varsity match 3 years running, 1910, 1911 and 1912, and took the 1500 metres in 1909 and 1911. At the university's sports days, he frequently competed the double, winning both the 800 and the 1500 metre races. Nationally, he ran at the Amateur Athletic Association Championships, finishing 5th in the 1500 metres in 1910 and 4th in 1911. That success, combined with his earlier American races for Haverford, earned him a place on the British team for the 1912 Stockholm Olympic Games. At Stockholm, he competed in both the 800 metres and the 1500 metres. In the 800 metres, he went out in the early rounds, but in the 1500 metres he reached the final. There he made a very characteristic choice. Instead of running purely for his own chances, he had set a hard pace to help his teammate Arnold Jackson time his finishing sprint. Jackson took gold, Baker finished 6th. He did not win a medal in 1912, but he saw something that stayed with him. Nations in fierce rivalry, with flags flying and pride on the line, but no guns, no trenches, and no dead. For him, the Olympics were a vision of what international rivalry could be. Competition without hatred, intensity without killing. Academically, Baker's path looked secure. In 1914, the year the First World War broke out in Europe, he was appointed Vice Principal of Ruskin College, Oxford, an institution devoted to giving working-class adults and trade unionists access to higher education. The war aside, in 1915 he was elected a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, returning to his alma mater in a permanent academic role later on. On paper, he seemed destined for a distinguished, if conventional, academic life. But the First World War, or the Great War, would change everything. War is a damnable, filthy thing. Phillip Noel Baker's words on the First World War. In August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. For Phillip Baker, a committed Quaker, taking up arms was impossible, but doing nothing whilst others suffered was equally unthinkable. Very quickly he became one of the driving forces behind a bold Quaker experiment, the Friends Ambulance Unit, the FAU. This was a volunteer medical corps, staffed largely by conscientious objectors who refused to kill but were prepared to risk their lives to save others. On the 7th of August 1914, as Friends in Britain, the Quakers, debated how to respond to the war, Baker and others put forward the idea of a civilian ambulance unit. When the idea met hesitation in the official Quaker meetings, he went ahead anyway. On the 21st of August 1914, his appeal for FAU volunteers was published in the Quaker journal The Friend, and the response was huge. On the 26th of October 1914, Baker and the mountaineer Geoffrey Winthrop Young met Sir Arthur Stanley, chairman of the Joint War Committee of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John, to negotiate official recognition and cooperation of the FAU and those aforementioned organisations. The result was an agreement. The FAU would operate under Red Cross auspices, but maintain its non-combatant, conscientious objector character. From late 1914 to 1915, Baker organised and led FAU operations near the Western Front, based at Dunkirk and working into the Ypres salient, one of the most heavily shelled sectors of the entire war. Under his administration, the FAU evacuated wounded soldiers from aid posts near the front, through casualty clearing stations and onto base hospitals. FAU cars carried thousands of casualties and drove tens of thousands of miles on cratered, dangerous roads within range of German artillery guns. One contemporary report records an FAU section carrying over 12,000 wounded and travelling more than 20,000 miles in a matter of months. Their work took them into ruined towns like Ypres and to hospitals such as Sacré-Cœur and Saint-Pierre, where shells could and did fall close by. Baker himself not only organised the logistics, but went forward, inspecting posts and riding in ambulances along roads that were frequent targets of artillery fire. The British military authorities, who did not share Quaker pacifism, respected what they saw. One senior officer is recorded as saying of the FAU, quote, "We don't accept their principles, but they have kept their word, played the game, and showed real courage." For his early service in France, Baker was awarded the Mons Star in 1915, officially the 1914 Star, a campaign medal reserved for those who had served under fire in France or Belgium between August and November 1914 with the British Expeditionary Force. The Mons Star was not a gallantry medal like the Victoria Cross, it was a campaign award, but to have it meant you had to have been there in the beginning, when the fighting was most chaotic and the British Army's survival was far from guaranteed. But this was not the end of Baker's Great War heroics. The following year in 1915, Baker's role changed. He became an adjutant, effectively second in command and chief administrator of the 1st British Ambulance Unit for Italy, also known as the British Committee in Aid of the Italian Wounded. This operated under the British Red Cross, but drew heavily on FAU personnel and ethos. From 1915 to 1918, he helped lead ambulance operations across the Italian front, where British forces supported the Italians against Austria-Hungary in places like Isonzo and the Piave. The casualty evacuation chain there, like in France, ran from frontline dressing stations back through aid posts and clearing stations to base hospitals. Baker's unit provided vital links in that chain with its motor ambulances and field hospitals. Be in no doubt, this was dangerous work. Ambulances had to move wounded men along exposed mountain roads, often under heavy shell fire or air attack, in harsh weather and at all hours. The drivers and orderlies were unarmed. Their protection was supposed to be the Red Cross emblem on their vehicles and uniforms, but this of course was not always respected. For his courage and leadership in Italy, Baker received 2 significant foreign gallantry awards. The Silver Medal for Military Valor, otherwise known as the Medaglia di Argento al Valore Militare, I hope that's correct pronunciation, from the Italian government in 1917, and the Croce di Guerra, the Italian War Cross, in 1918. These were not routine campaign medals. They were awards for bravery and distinguished service in the field. Combined with the Mons Star, they meant that a man who refused to carry a weapon had nonetheless been officially recognised for courage by 3 countries: Britain, France, through the Red Cross system, and Italy. Now you might have noticed some disparity in how I have listed Noel Baker's surname. In the midst of the Great War, in June 1915, Philip Baker married Irene Noel, a nurse working in a field hospital in East Grinstead. According to the Nobel biography, she was the daughter of a British landowner in Greece, another thread in the web of international connections that surrounded Philip's life. After the war in 1921, Philip formally took her surname alongside his own, becoming Phillip Noel Baker by deed poll. The war left deep marks on Philip. He had seen trenches, bombardments, shattered towns and gas victims. He had worked day and night to move the wounded out of hellish landscapes that looked nothing like the heroic paintings of war. Those experiences burned into him a conviction he would carry for the rest of his long life. War is a damnable, filthy thing and has destroyed civilization after civilization. That is the essence of my belief. The words of Phillip himself. When the fighting ended in November 1918, Noel Baker moved almost immediately into international diplomacy. In 1918, he served as an aide at the Paris Peace Conference, working with Lord Robert Cecil on the design of a new international order. One key project was the creation of a so-called League of Nations. The League of Nations, founded in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, was the world's first permanent international organisation dedicated specifically to preventing war. Its aims were to provide a forum where states could resolve disputes peacefully, to uphold collective security, the idea that an attack on one member was in principle an attack on all, and to coordinate international cooperation on issues like health, labour standards and refugees. The League's efficacy aside, these were its stated aims and principles. Noel Baker helped draft parts of the League's covenant, its founding charter, and then became assistant to the League's first Secretary General, Sir Eric Drummond. From 1919 to 1922, he worked in Geneva inside the League's Secretariat. Phillip was particularly involved in the mandate system, which placed former German and Ottoman territories under League oversight. In theory, the mandates were to be governed in the interests of their inhabitants, with a view to eventual self-government, rather than simply annexed by the victors. In practice, the system often blurred into rebranded empire, and Noel Baker was fully aware of its limitations. He also played a role in persuading the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen to become the League's High Commissioner for Refugees in 1921, a post that led to the famous Nansen passports for stateless people. From these years, Phillip drew a lasting lesson. Peace required more than goodwill. It needed institutions, rules, and some way of controlling armaments. If states went on rearming in secret, out of fear, or retaliation and mistrust, war would indeed return. After leaving Geneva and the League of Nations, Noel Baker returned to academic life, though he also studied for a time in Munich and Paris and became fluent in several languages. In 1920, however, he stepped once more into the spotlight, this time back as an athlete. The 1920 Antwerp Olympic Games were the first Olympics held after the First World War. They opened on the 14th of August 1920 in Belgium, a country devastated by German invasion and occupation. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey were not invited. The games were meant to be a symbol. After 4 years of slaughter, nations meeting again on tracks and fields rather than battlefields. Noel Baker captained the British track team and carried the Union flag at the opening ceremony. In the 800 metres, he won his first round heat, but chose not to run the semi-final, concentrating instead on his best event, the 1500 metres. On the 19th of August 1920, he lined up for the 1500 metres final. Running in British colours, he stayed with his teammate Albert Hill for much of the race. Hill surged to win gold in 4 minutes and 1.8 seconds. Noel Baker followed him home in 4 minutes and 0.23 seconds, winning the silver Olympic medal for Great Britain. An American, Lawrence Shields, took the bronze. So in 1920, just 2 years after riding in ambulances along mud-churned frontline roads, Phillip Noel Baker stood on an Olympic podium. In 1924, at the Paris Olympics, he again served as captain of the British team, though he no longer competed himself. That same year, he was appointed the first Sir Ernest Cassel Professor of International Relations at the University of London, based at the London School of Economics, or the LSE. It was one of the very first professorships in this field anywhere in the world. He held the chair until 1929, and going back in 1926, he published The League of Nations at Work and Disarmament. explaining Geneva's machinery to ordinary readers and making an early, systematic case against arm races. Later on, in the academic year of 1933 to 1934, he was lecturing again at Yale University in the United States, bringing his ideas on peace, law and arms control to American students. By the mid-1920s, Phillip Noel Baker had become, again, three things at once: an academic authority on international relations, an experienced practitioner of diplomacy, and a decorated Olympic silver medalist. This is in addition to his status as a Great War veteran with the FAU. Phillip's full-time political career began when he joined the Labour Party. In 1924, he stood as Labour candidate for Birmingham Handsworth, a safe Conservative seat, and he lost. But the attempt marked his entry into electoral politics. On the 30th of May 1929, in the general election that brought Labour into office under Ramsay MacDonald, Noel Baker was elected Member of Parliament for Coventry. He became Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Foreign Secretary at the time, Arthur Henderson, who was another passionate advocate of disarmament and international cooperation. The Great Depression and political crisis of the early 1930s shattered that first Labour government. In the general election of the 27th of October 1931, which was dominated by the formation of a so-called national government, Labour was crushed and Noel Baker lost his Coventry seat. However, his work on disarmament intensified when, in February 1932, the League of Nations convened the World Disarmament Conference in Geneva. Henderson was appointed its president. Noel Baker became his assistant and right hand. For nearly 2 years, he sat at the heart of the most ambitious attempt ever to negotiate global arms reductions. The timing, of course, you must understand, from his perspective, was terrible. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, and in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and by October 1933, Germany had withdrew from both the Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations. Other states throughout the world clung to their weapons, fearful and mistrustful, and of course, the Allied nations began to rearm as well. The conference collapsed without agreement. Many years later after the war, in 1979, Noel Baker would revisit this experience in his book, The First World Disarmament Conference 1932 to 1933 and Why It Failed. In this book, he explains how, in his opinion, nationalism, fear, and the absence of robust enforcement mechanisms doomed the peace effort. Going back to the 1930s, he returned to Parliament on the 9th of July 1936, when he was elected MP for Derby in a by-election. He would represent Derby and, after boundary changes in 1950, Derby South, continuously until he retired from the House of Commons on the 29th of May 1970. Throughout the 1930s, as the threat of war rose in Europe, Noel Baker increasingly focused on the dangers of the arms industry itself. In 1936, he published The Private Manufacture of Armaments, expanding on an earlier pamphlet he wrote, Hawkers of Death. In these works, he argued that allowing private companies to profit from selling weapons created structural incentives for rearmament and war. Arms, he insisted, were not ordinary commodities. When corporations could make fortunes from building weapons, they had strong reasons to lobby for bigger defence budgets and to encourage fear. He called for far greater public control and international regulation of the arms trade. The problems he highlighted would later be echoed in debates about the so-called military-industrial complex, the tight network of relationships between arms manufacturers, politicians and military planners. As the Second World War broke out in 1939, Noel Baker again entered government, this time in a conventional ministerial role. During the war in February 1942, he was appointed Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of War Transport in Winston Churchill's coalition government. The Ministry of War Transport was responsible for shipping, railways, merchant fleets and ports, the arteries that kept Britain alive under U-boat attack and made possible the movement of troops and supplies. Noel Baker became the ministry's spokesman in the House of Commons. After the war, in the general election of July 1945, Labour won a landslide under Clement Attlee. Noel Baker was then appointed Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, working under the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, to shape the post-World War settlement. In that role, he headed the British delegation to the United Nations Preparatory Commission, which met in London in late 1945 to design the structures and procedures of a new global organisation. The United Nations, founded in 1945, was created to replace the League of Nations. It aimed to prevent future wars, promote human rights, and foster international cooperation. Crucially, it included all the major victorious powers of the Second World War, including the United States and the Soviet Union, whose absence had undermined the League of Nations. Noel Baker served on the subcommittee that drew up the provisional agenda for the first UN General Assembly, which met in London in January 1946 in the Methodist Central Hall in Westminster, a short walk from the Houses of Parliament. In October 1946, he became Secretary of State for Air, responsible for the Royal Air Force. In this capacity, he also played a significant role in preparations for the 1948 London Olympic Games, sometimes called the Austerity Olympics, ensuring that, despite bomb damage and ongoing rationing, Britain could host the first post-war games. In October 1947, he was appointed Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations, managing Britain's relations with the self-governing dominions and the evolving Commonwealth of Nations, at a moment when empire was beginning to give way to independent nations. He held that post until February 1950. From the 15th of February 1950 until the 31st of October 1951, he then served as Minister of Fuel and Power, overseeing Britain's coal, gas and electricity sectors in a period of rationing and reconstruction. In 1946 to 1947, he also served as chairman of the Labour Party, one of the top roles in the party's internal organisation. Now, all of these appointments over these many years were substantial offices, but across them all ran a single thread: Noel Baker's obsession with stopping the arms race before it destroyed everything. The explosion of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 had changed the stakes forever. Humanity now possessed weapons capable of wiping out entire cities in seconds. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, the Cold War hardened. The United States and the Soviet Union both built up vast nuclear stockpiles. The doctrine of deterrence, the idea that peace could be maintained if each side feared total destruction by the other, became the dominant strategic logic. This was also known as mutually assured destruction, or you might know it as the MAD doctrine. Phillip Noel Baker was no admirer of Soviet policies, but he refused to accept that the world's safety could permanently rest on the threat of mutually assured destruction. He believed that relying on nuclear deterrence was like balancing civilization on a razor's edge. In the 1950s, he returned to sustained research and writing on disarmament, drawing on experiences from the 1907 Hague Peace Conference, the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the 1932 to 1933 Geneva Disarmament Conference, and his work at the League and the early UN. He set out to produce a comprehensive, realistic, and historically informed study of the arms race. The result was The Arms Race, a programme for world disarmament, published in 1958. It ran to nearly 600 pages long and did 4 things. It offered a historical survey of armament build-ups from the 19th century to the nuclear age. It analysed, in his opinion, the economic and political forces which he described as fear, nationalism and commercial interests that drove states to rearm. It critiqued secret diplomacy and the lack of transparency in defence policy, and it set out a detailed programme for phased, verified disarmament under international control, centred on a greatly strengthened United Nations machinery. Phillip argued that disarmament had to be mutual, negotiated and verified, not unilateral and not based on trust alone. He called for international inspection and enforcement powers, strong enough to give states confidence that their neighbours were not cheating. And he stressed that the economic benefits of cutting arms spending and redirecting resources to human needs, schools, hospitals, development, were enormous but often ignored. In 1960, the arms race won the Albert Schweitzer Book Prize, recognising both its scholarship and its moral urgency. In 1959, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded Phillip Noel Baker the Nobel Peace Prize, citing his, quote, long-standing contribution to the cause of disarmament and peace. He remains the only person in history to have won both an Olympic medal and a Nobel Prize. On the 11th of December 1959, he delivered his Nobel lecture in Oslo titled Peace and the Arms Race. Drawing on 4 decades of negotiation, research and reflection, he made 3 central claims: that the arms race was not a law of nature but a human choice, that every pound or dollar spent on weapons was a pound or dollar not spent on education, health or development, and that in the nuclear age survival itself depended on a conscious decision to build institutions of peace. Disarmament, he told his audience, is for every nation the safest and most practicable system of defence. War, he insisted, was man-made, and what human beings had made, they could unmake. The Nobel Prize did not mark the end of Noel Baker's disarmament crusade. If anything, it intensified it. Throughout the 1960s, he remained active in Parliament and in international forums. He served on bodies such as the UN Economic and Social Council and continued to write and speak about nuclear testing, arms control, and the need to reduce conventional forces. He strongly supported the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space and underwater, the first significant arms control agreement of the nuclear age. And from 1960 to 1976, he served as the president of the International Council of Sport, Science and Physical Education, based in West Germany. This role combined his 2 lifelong passions, sport and peace. He believed that physical education and international sport could promote mutual understanding and healthier societies, reducing the appeal of militarism. He remained MP for Derby South until he voluntarily retired from the House of Commons at the general election of the 29th of May 1970, closing a parliamentary career that had begun in 1929, being interrupted by defeat in 1931 and resumed from 1936 to 1970. Even as an elder statesman, he refused to retire from the cause. He declared, quote, "While I have the health and strength, I shall give all my time to the work of breaking the dogmatic sleep of those who allow the nuclear, chemical and biological and conventional arms races to go on." In the Silver Jubilee Honours of June 1977, at the age of 87, he was created a life peer as Baron Noel Baker of the City of Derby, and on the 22nd of July 1977, he took his seat in the House of Lords. From there, he continued to speak on disarmament and foreign policy well into his 80s and 90s. On the 21st of February 1979, he opened a major debate in the Lords on the final document of the UN Special Session on Disarmament, analysing its strengths and weaknesses and urging Britain to treat it as a serious basis for further action. That same year in 1979, he co-founded the World Disarmament Campaign with his old friend Fenner Brockway. The campaign aimed to popularise the United Nations disarmament agenda and to oppose both nuclear weapons and the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. Noel Baker served as co-chair until his death. Even in 1982, during the Falklands War, he spoke in the House of Lords, warning again of the costs and dangers of relying on military force to settle disputes. Phillip Noel Baker died on the 8th of October 1982 in Westminster, London, at the age of 92. He was buried alongside Irene in the churchyard at Hayshot in West Sussex. By then, he had spent nearly 7 decades working, in one form or another, for peace. As an ambulance worker in the First World War, as a League of Nations official, as a professor of international relations, as an MP, as a minister, as a critic of the arms trade, as a Nobel laureate, and finally, as a venerable voice in the House of Lords and in global campaigns. What makes Phillip Noel Baker's life so singular is not just the rare double distinction of an Olympic medal and a Nobel Peace Prize, although that alone would secure him a memorable footnote in history. It is the way his experience in each sphere fed into the others. His Quaker upbringing and frontline service with the FAU convinced him that war was not a heroic adventure, but a moral catastrophe. His academic work at LSE, Yale and elsewhere gave him the conceptual tools to understand how arms races start, how institutions operate and why they fail. His League of Nations and United Nations experience showed him from the inside both the possibilities and limitations of international cooperation. His athletic career and role in the Olympic movement strengthened his beliefs that international rivalry could be civilized and creative rather than destructive. His political offices gave him direct influence over policy, even when he was often swimming against the current of prevailing strategic thought. At every stage, he returned to the same central question: how can humanity escape the cycle of armament and war? In the end, his answer rested on three pillars: law and institutions. War must be outlawed and replaced by systems of arbitration and collective security, backed by real international courts and organisations. Transparency and control of armaments. The arms trade and weapons production must be subjected to public scrutiny and international regulation, not left to secret deals and private profit. Education and public opinion. Citizens must understand the dangers of the arms race and demand different priorities. Schools instead of missiles, hospitals instead of bombs. These ideas run like a thread from his early work in Geneva, through his work, The Private Manufacture of Armaments and the Arms Race, to his Nobel lecture and his last speeches in the House of Lords. Today, when we talk about arms control treaties, nuclear test ban agreements, verification regimes and the role of civil society in disarmament, we are operating in a landscape that Phillip Noel Baker helped to map. He was an athlete who believed that discipline and fair play applied as much to nations as to runners on a track. He was a politician who refused to accept that realism meant surrendering to ever-growing stockpiles of weapons. He was a scholar who never stopped trying to learn from failure and to draw lessons for the future. In short, he was, quite literally, an Olympian for peace, a man who took the spirit of the games into the vastly more dangerous arena of world politics, and who devoted his long life to the belief that, as he put it, we can abolish war if we have the will to do so.